For my third grade lesson plan, I chose to do it on visualization as a reading skill. Um, so what is my big idea and goal for the lesson? So the goal for this lesson is for students to identify and understand the visualization while reading many literacy texts. I want the students to know and learn what visualization is, and I want them to visualize parts of literacy during their own times of reading, as well as our times of reading in class. My objectives are students will be able to identify and define visualization through many sorts of text. Students will also be able to construct visuals of readings and topics throughout literacy. For their assessment, so throughout the activity, I'll be assessing my students throughout their guided practice and independent practice. During this, I'll take notes, and what they're describing to me as they're individually reading. Ideally, I'll only be assessing during guided and independent practice. For my hook, as readers, you will form pictures in your mind so that you can better understand the text. So for my mini lesson, I will do a class anchor chart, a small one, first on visualization. I will introduce it by connecting to their background knowledge. I'll tell my students to close their eyes and think of their favorite movie. I will then have them open their eyes and tell me, and I will explain what visualization is and how they just did that. We will go through the visualization anchor chart, where we will be able to identify what visualization is and how we will use visualization in reading. We will read A Time for Kids, just posted, about the 2020 presidential election in class. I will be able to talk about my visualizations with my students as I model visualization, preparing them for guided practice. Throughout this, I will also look for students' responses on their own visualizations about the current events that are taking place. I will have them share with me what they're visualizing. Then at the end, I'm going to have them share their visualizations and thoughts on what we just read. This will help me prepare them for their guided and individual practice. I'm also hitting a social studies standard while doing this in a cross-curricular way, which I think is kind of important because I didn't even realize that that's what I was doing during this until I was like, oh wait, that's like a social studies standard for third grade. So for the guided practice, I will then read a passage from a book that we're reading in class called Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. I will pause at certain points and ask the students what they might be visualizing. So during the mini lesson, I'm modeling the visualization. During guided practice, I'm having my students do it. If my students are having a hard time with it, that is where I can take a step back and kind of like, determine if they're capable of moving on to independent practice or if we still need to go back and re-unpack that. For the independent practice, I will then have students find a spot around the room where they can read their book. I will conference with my students individually during reading time on a book that they are reading on their own. I will ask my students what they have visualized throughout their story. So really, all I'm going to do is just, they're going to go to a spot around their room during like a set time for reading, and I can assess them by going up and, kind of asking students in an informal way, oh, what's going on in your book right now? Like, can you picture it? Can you visualize it for me? And I'm going to have them tell me, and, this will be a good way for me to do like an informal assessment. The standards that I used are 3.2.2. It's a social studies standard. Identify and know the significance of fundamental democratic principles and ideals, and it kind of talks about that for the Time for Kids. 3.2.6, explain the role citizens have in making decisions and rules within the community, so state and nation, such as participating in local and regional activities, voting in elections, and running for office and voicing opinions in a positive way. For my literacy standard, it's 3.sl.3.1. Retell, paraphrase, and explain the main ideas and supporting details of a text, read aloud, or information presented in a diverse media and formats, including visually, quantitatively, and orally. And then my social justice standard is standard 2, civic. So students explain what it means to be citizens of their community, state, and nation, so on and so forth. So how I'll open this up is I'll dive right into like an activity for social studies. So we'll do our Time for Kids. So I'll talk to my students throughout that piece of Time for Kids. I'll have brief pauses in regards to, okay, well, what are we visualizing now? Like it talks about in the Time for Kids, oh, okay, we're waiting on states. Like what do you picture us waiting on states when it comes to our voting? And then we'll move right in to the anchor chart. So I'll have the anchor chart up on the board, where I'm like the students will be making the anchor chart. Like we're gonna make it as a class. So I'll have the part where it's visualization and the definition of visualization, and then we'll put points on like throughout the anchor chart, like how can we visualize, what is visualization, etc. And I believe I attached an example of one in my lesson plan. And then I will move into the guided practice where, again, I'll read the passage from the book and ask the students a question. So that's really hitting that, I've hit that I do as I model it during the Time for Kids activity during my mini lesson. And they're going to do the we do as a group. We're doing it as a group during their guided practice. And then they're doing it as the you do part in their independent practice. And I think this is going to be a good way to help them understand visualization during their reading.